Hey, think about somebody right now. I want you to think about some of your favorite people in the world. And it may be somebody that's already left this world that you think back and they were just your favorite people. You loved being around them. Maybe they made you laugh, or maybe they just really cared for you. And just think about a couple of those people right now. Those favorite people of yours. Let me ask you this question. Were they perfect? Are they perfect? Have they got some flaws and some things? If you allow yourself to think about some of the things that they've done, yeah, they kind of got that mark against them. Yeah, they messed up that time, or they had this characteristic about them that really wasn't that great. Let me ask you this as a second question. Does it make you love them any less? In the whole sum of life, are they not just as important to you, even though that you could see some of their flaws, that they had some scars from bad decisions in the past and things like that? I think I know the answer to that, because we've all got people like that. During the month of May, we're focusing on some of the great women of the Bible, and what better month to do that than May, when we celebrate, Mother's Day. And the woman that we're going to look at today fits that description quite well, of someone who was a great person, but they definitely had their flaws. And that's the woman, Sarah. And she had two names. Early part of the life that we know her through the Bible, she was Sarai. And then God changed her name later to Sarah. And so I'll be using that name interchangeably today. But it's the same person. And depending on how much you know from the Old Testament and know these stories, know the story of Sarah, determines what you think of her. And on one side of things, she is listed in the New Testament in the Great Hall of Fame of Faith. She is used as an example and held up to women to be a woman of grace and a great example to follow, and how to love your husband and your family. But on the other side of Sarah, when you look at some of the problems she had, she could be vengeful, spiteful, whiny, jealous, unreasonable, and erratic. Sounds like us, doesn't it? Some good things and some bad things that we have in our life. I guess one way you could describe Sarah was that her life was a constant battle between following the flesh or following faith. Faith and flesh. And that was her constant battle through life. Now, as we see, she was a very human person. We also see that she was a faithful person to God. Now, the very first time that we're introduced to Sarah is in Genesis 11. Now, most of our time is going to be spent jumping around in the book of Genesis. So if you want to follow along, that'd be great. You may want to jot down the places, because reading her entire story is going to be much better than what little bit I tell you today. But in Genesis 11, verse 30, it says this: "Now Sarai was barren. She had no children." Now that one statement kind of sums up her life. It's going to sum up the good of her life and the bad of her life. That one thing, that she did not have any children, determined where her life went, good and bad. God comes to Abraham, and he tells him this in Genesis 12, verse 1. He says, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." Then he goes on to tell Abraham that he's going to be the father of a great nation. It's going to be so many people come from you that it'll be like trying to count the stars or the sand on the seashore. And so Abraham packs up his family, Sarah, and they move. They take off, and they, not even knowing where they're going, they just obey God's voice and they go. Now, if you want to do some good reading, better than any reality show you could ever watch on television, read the story of Sarah and Abraham and some of the stuff that they got into. Faithful and unfaithful things. We're just going to touch on really one thing today. But go and read that yourself. Sarah knows the promise that God has given to Abraham, that he's going to be the father of a great nation. And to be the father of a great nation, you've got to have a child. You got to have it start somewhere. So that really speaks to her heart, not only that it's going to be something for God, but she's finally going to get a child. And she's going to get a son here. So she is holding on and waiting for God to give this blessing to her. But the time goes on. Have you ever been in those situations where time just drags? When it just drags along? Greg Webb and I walked into a business this week, and it was a hotel motel. And if you haven't noticed, a lot of times people who work in those places ain't from around here. Have you picked up on that? You know, I'm observant about stuff like that. But I walk in, I go, and a man walks out, and he's standing there, and I said, hello, I said, I'm Greg Sexton from Macedonia Christian Church. How are you doing? Did someone call earlier about us getting a room for a gentleman to stay here? And I kind of look over at Greg, and I said, and we just stand there, and he keeps going. And time is dragging. I can't think of anything else to say to try to get to it. Finally, somebody else comes. But time drags when you're waiting. Think about this. That was 10 seconds. Did it seem like a lot longer? Imagine if you're Sarah and you've got the promise that you've always waited for. You're going to have a child. You're going to have a son, and it's not 10 seconds that goes by. But from the time of the promise to where we're going to pick up right here in just a moment was 10 years. 10 years that she's waiting. Now, as you understand, the driving force in her life was to have a child, and God, in her eyes, has evidently forgotten them, you can see trouble coming. You can see a mistake on the horizon. Sarah sees the biological clock ticking, and she's, after all these years of waiting, this is what happens. Now we skip all the way over to Genesis 16, verse 1 and 2, it says this. Genesis 16, it says this. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, you notice Abram's name has not been changed yet either. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. And when you read that last part, the Lord has kept me from having children, you can take that two ways. Without reading anything else, you can take it two ways. One is that she recognized, maybe she's a very faithful person and recognizes that everything comes through God. That unless God is behind it, she has no hope. That it's going to come from God. Or it could be that she's saying, God is withholding something. God has forgotten me. God is being cruel to me. Now, when you see what the next statement is, you'll see which it is. She goes on and says, go, sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarai said. This is one of those moments when you're a husband and the wife says you can go do something or you can buy something, and you go, it sounds good, but is this a test? Is this a test? Do you really mean this? And you kind of look for the camera, is this being filmed? And you kind of say, this can't be real. This has got to be a trap. But any way you look at this, it boils down to one thing. Sarah is tired of waiting on God, and she's taking charge of the situation. She is tired of waiting on God. She decides that God needs some help to fulfill His promise to her. Helping God has become more important to her than being obedient to God. Her reasoning is very simple. I can't have a child. It's apparent, it's obvious. I'm not going to be able to have a child. So, my servant can have one for me, and that will be a way to fulfill, and I can start a family by doing that. So I'm going to give my servant to my husband to sleep with, have a baby, and it'll be my baby. What could possibly go wrong? We're going to be one big happy family. I can't wait. Well, it sounds good. But you see, this was not a strange idea to the area they were living in, to the culture of that day, for men to do this. But it was new and it was strange for a follower of God to do something like this. God tolerated it through periods of history, but he never suggested it and he never agreed with it. And this is what they do. It's not pleasing to God. The desire to have a child is a strong desire. Any mother and father here understands that. It is a blessed desire. It's not a sinful desire. But when that desire or any desire moves you around God, that you do an end run around God, that you ignore God, that you move ahead of God, it becomes a sin. Too many people have had the desire to be married, which is nothing wrong with. But they've married out of God's will, and they suffer a lifetime for it. Many people desire to have acceptance. Nothing wrong with that. But then because they want to be accepted, they do things that are outside of God's will, and it leads to pain. People long for love. And as the old song said, looking for love in all the wrong places. The best, when you want the best for your kids, nothing wrong with that. But when that moves us outside of the will of God, and we do an end run around God and what he tells us about raising our children, it's wrong. And it leads to destruction. Any desire that leads us outside of God's will leads to disaster. Look at verse 4. Talking about Abram, it says, he slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress, talking about Sarah. What could possibly go wrong? This is a great plan. You'll have a son through my maidservant, Hagar. But they didn't even make it to the birth of the baby before there was problems. The first time you read this, it sounds strange. Why was Hagar upset with Sarah? But once again, when you mess with God's plan and God's order, don't expect things to go smoothly. No one stopped to think about it. Abram's thinking about Sarah. Sarah's thinking about herself. Nobody thought about Hagar. But she's thrust into a position of now, how is she supposed to handle all of these emotions and what's taking place? She's a servant girl, but now she's going to have the son, which is obviously going to be the father of a great nation, but she's just going to give that child up? She's going to be a nobody in this? Nobody thought about the emotions and the problems that she would have through this. Maybe she was wrong in rubbing salt into the wounds of Sarah. Maybe she loved Abram herself. Maybe she wanted to become his wife. Anytime you move outside, your desires move you outside of the will of God, destruction comes. Look at verse 5. Then Sarai said to Abraham, you are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. Did I miss something? Is there a page missing from my Bible? Look in yours. Did I miss something? Sarah said, here she is, sleep with her, give us a child. Abraham, okay, I will. And then all of a sudden, Sarah comes back and says, this is your fault. I'm missing something. But you can't make this stuff up, can you? You can't make this stuff up. This is what she says. But you know that any time we go outside of the will of God, when our desires lead us someplace they can't go, when we ever try to do God's job different than what God would do it, things go wrong. She goes on and says this, I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. You know, it's the problem that anybody could see coming. But it gets worse. Verse 6, your servant is in your hands. Abram said this. He says, your servant is in your hands. Do with her whatever you think best. Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. And like I say, that just reads a soap opera, a reality show. You need to read this whole section on Abraham and Sarah. Abraham wasn't any better in the situation than Sarah was. Being the leader of this home, he should have said, no, this is not right. But he went along with it. And then when there was problems, he says, you handle it. You do whatever you think is right. Instead of once again stepping up as the leader in the home and handling the situation. Look at all the things that went wrong. Sarah was unreasonable. The absolute worst comes out in her. Hagar was put in a situation she couldn't handle and reacted in a very wrong way. Abraham not only sinned by doing this, but he sinned by not being the leader. And the bad news just keeps coming. The son was born. His name is Ishmael. Ishmael grew up in a fractured family. He could never express his love to his father and his father to him because of the jealousy and the dysfunction that was in that family. There was always a rift in that family. Always. Very dysfunctional. I'm not saying that Sarah wasn't a great woman, that she wasn't a woman of faith. Because of her errors in judgment, she paid a terrible price. And all the people around her paid a terrible price. What can we learn from Sarah? What can we learn that Sarah didn't learn? Well, I think we can sum it up in one word. Remember. Remember. Remember who you are. Remember who God is. Remember what God's promises are. Remember what God's track record is. Remember what God's batting average is, if you want to say it that way. He never strikes out. And when he says, I'm going to do something, it will be done. It will be done in his time. Remember that God has a plan. Always. Remember that God has made you and he's made me a part of the plan. Both of these people, Abraham and Sarah, forgot these things. God goes on and he reminds Abraham on at least 3 occasions that he's going to make him the father of a great nation. But he also reminds Sarah through Abraham. Look in Genesis 17, verse 15 and 16, it says this. This is God talking to Abraham, and this is at the point where he changes the names. Abram becomes Abraham, and that's a name change from exalted father to father of many. And Sarai to Sarah, which meant her name meant my princess, and God changed it to princess. As for Sarai, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah. Now notice all of the words that apply to Sarah. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of people will come from her. It's almost like God is saying, I thought we had this straight, Abraham. Let me say it as plain as it can be said. It's you and Sarah and no one else. Have you got that straight? Think y'all can keep it straight now? This is for all of us. What we learn from Sarah is for all of us. But I want the women, I want the young ladies, I want the youth to really lean in and listen to what I want to say here for the next few minutes. Really listen. Just like Sarah was part of this great plan, you are part of a great plan. Every one of us. But ladies, young girls here, please listen. You're part of a great plan. From the very beginning of time when God was creating everything, he would get to the end of the day. And you remember that phrase that God said over and over? He looked at things and he said, it is good. And he gets down to the end, and the last crowning touches here is he creates Adam and he creates Eve. And it's at the end of creating Eve, he changed the phrase just a little bit. It's not, it is good. It is very good. From the very beginning, He has pointed out that you are an essential part of the plan. I have always had a plan for you. Now, we just finished that series, Did God Really Say That?, where we looked at how the devil has taken so many truths of God and twisted them just enough to mess up the whole thing. And we looked at some of the lies he's told and deceptions he's carried. We didn't talk about the lies that he's told to women. And he has done a number on women. Convinced men and women of this lie. When it comes to the value of a woman, he really twisted the truth. I cringe at what young women have to try to live up to. I cringe at what society has done to the value of a woman, and what they have to try to live up to. And in the process of trying to live up to society and culture's value they place, it's actually a living down to value. Because to live up to those values of our society, you must deny many of the values of God. It's criminal and it's impossible to attain. Just think about these things. According to the Sentencing Project, a group who studies prison population, between 1980 and 2014, the number of incarcerated women increased by more than 700%. From 1980 to 2014, the number of women in prison increased 700%. Now, there's always will be more men in prison than women. But in that same period of time, the rate of increase between men and women, the number of women incarcerated rose 50% faster. You may understand what I'm saying? Always going to be more men, because you know how we are. But the women, it's outpaced the men by 50%. In state prisons, 60% of the women incarcerated have children under 18 years of age while they're in prison. It's devastating to women. It's devastating to our culture. Research, statistics, your own observation. Talk to any law enforcement professional. And I tried to do that this week, talk to a couple of guys and say, what have you noticed different about women in our culture and what you have to deal with as a law enforcement personnel? And they will tell you that there's been a tremendous change. Fighting in public, foul language. One police officer told me a woman will cuss a police officer out faster than a man will. Contempt for authority, feuding, battling. If you don't believe me, look on Facebook. The feuds that go on between women. If you don't think that there's been a change in the grace and dignity of women, then just go to a ball game. Any age ball game, and listen. Greg Webb and I, a couple years ago, walked in the Subway to eat, and we had gotten our food, and a man and woman came in. It was a long line. The man and woman came in, and she started giving the woman behind the counter that fixes the sandwiches a hard time. Very loud, and holding everything up. And finally, a man said, "Lady, it's a long line. Why don't you just let the woman do her job? Let's move on." And she turned on him and verbally began to abuse him and just kept on. And finally, her husband steps in. Next thing we know, her husband has bumped against the other guy, and he slams him against the wall. Well, it's all right. You got to go out to eat more. And slams him against the wall, and several of us jump up, and we kind of break everything up, and the man's laying in the floor hurt. And you know what she's doing? She's still yelling at the other guy about he needed to mind his own business. And I'm going to get shot one day, I know it. It's what Janice tells me all the time. But I said, Lady, don't you think you need to be concerned about your husband and not winning an argument? And I talked to some of the ladies at Subway. Police came and everything. It was just a wonderful dinner. I talked to one of the ladies a few days later, and they said when they looked at the security cameras, none of us caught it that day. She pushed her husband into the other man to cause the conflict. So if you want excitement, you see Greg Webb and I out eating somewhere, come sit with us. If you don't, go eat somewhere else. Women have forgotten, or they have never been told, what an essential part of the plans of God that they are. For family, for decency in the world, and for evangelism in the world. 1 Peter 3 and 4. Beautiful scripture says this. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment such as braided hair and the wearing of gold jewelry and fine clothes. And some take that to mean that women shouldn't have these things. I think it means that shouldn't be where your beauty is found. You can have these things, but that's not where your beauty is to be found. Verse 4 says, instead, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great value in God's sight. If this world ever needed a large dose of feminine grace, calmness, dignity, it is now. It is now. The world needs it, and the woman, just her presence and of dignity and comfort and calmness in situations cannot be brought by anybody else. I love what Patricia Schreier says in her book, The Resolution for Women. Talking to women, she says this, says, we are on a platform every day, a position entrusted to us each morning when we swing our legs out of bed. You and I remain constantly in the spotlight, where the life we've resolved to live will either champion or demote the beauty of biblical femininity. And that means sensitivity, gentleness, womanhood. Then she goes on and says this is what I love. We will cause our daughters either to desire it or to fight against it. We will encourage our sons either to appreciate it or take advantage of it. Wow. God has a plan, and you are an essential part of the plan. Nothing that God gave man to do can man complete by himself. Adam and Eve, Abraham and Sarah. The great things he cannot accomplish without the part of a woman. Look at this beautiful, beautiful verse. We go all the way back to Genesis 1:27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Now read this last phrase with me. Male and female, he created them. Male and female, he created them. You see, you and I are marked. We are sealed with approval of God himself. We bear, men and women, we bear the resemblance of God himself. Because he said, I created both of you in my image. And by doing that, he says, I have a plan. I have a plan because of you. You're involved. And I don't question Sarah's love for her husband. I don't question Sarah's love for her God. But because of her actions, the ugliest part of her life was revealed for all to see. And I'm sure that our ugly sides, our ugly actions, and our mistakes will not be revealed in the sense that hers was. But the world still sees them. And the world still suffers because of them. So, what brings out the ugliest part of your life? I don't have to know you to know what it is. It's when you move outside of God's will. When we move outside of God's will. Don't let women, let me come back to you one more time. Women, don't let anyone convince you you're not part of God's plan just the way you are. That you are essential to the plans of God. Don't let any man, don't let any desire that you have take you outside of that. Never let that happen.